Hey guys, I'm Abby Martin and this is Breaking the Set. So yesterday, America woke up to yet another mass killing spree right here in Washington, D.C. In the coming days, you'll probably hear the same superficial debate playing out across the corporate media. The NRA will blame the incident on anything but guns, and the far left will demonize the entire gun-holding population. But considering how the U.S. has placed itself as the military capital of the world, it should come as no surprise that many Americans have chosen to militarize themselves. There are 89 firearms per 100 people in this country, nearly twice as many guns per capita than the next highest gun-toting nation. For every 100,000 people in the U.S., more than 3 will die at the hand of a gun, by far the highest rate in the industrialized world. So what's to blame? It's a unique problem, and one that requires a more thoughtful analysis of how and why these things happen here in America. And it begs the question, just how many more mass shootings will we have to endure until this debate is fueled by reality and not politics? September 17, 2011. It was the wake of the financial collapse. People were losing their homes and unable to pay their debts. However, the top 1% remained completely unaffected. So on that day, Americans decided to stand up to corporate greed and let Wall Street bankers know that it's time for real change.
The economy is crashing around all of us, and people are starving to death, and people don't have jobs, and you walk down the streets of Manhattan and there's more homeless people than you could ever imagine, and yet the greed in these corporations. You want to take million-dollar trips around the world because you think you deserve it, you can pretty much just go somewhere and die because it's not even okay. There's a lot of people that have worked very hard for what they have and what they had and what they are losing. The misconception about all of this is that America thinks that we're okay, and we are not okay. And more people need to get together like we're doing here and protest for our rights and what we deserve as human beings, because people don't seem to get it at all.
To me, there was nothing abnormal at all about these demonstrators. This is nowhere comparable to me, Gandhi or Martin Luther King. To me, it was just an anarchy-type group.
Shame, shame. And I give them a piece of our mind today, aren't we? Shame on you.
How about the treatment of the protesters by law enforcement?
I want you to have the pepper spray in your face. I want you to have it in your face right now. I want you to have pepper spray. I really want you to feel that.
All right, we got everybody out. Let's go.
It's been 2 years since the Occupy Wall Street movement erupted across the country, and since that time, outrage with the U.S. financial system has only escalated. A new Reuters poll shows that only 15% of Americans are satisfied with the government's effort to prosecute Wall Street bankers in the aftermath of the financial collapse. Former police captain Ray Lewis is part of the other 85%, but he would argue he's also part of the 99%. See, Lewis was a retired captain of the Philadelphia police force when he decided to go to New York and protest in full uniform. Unsurprisingly, he was arrested along with many others. And instead of receiving support from his fellow officers, he was instead threatened with the retraction of his pension. So to talk more about his activism and why he chose to protest on behalf of the people instead of the rich and powerful, I'm joined now by Ray Lewis. Thank you so much for coming on, Ray.
Thank you, Abby, for having me.
So, Ray, have you continued with your activism since being arrested at Occupy Wall Street?
I absolutely have. Even though it hasn't been published, I've been involved in a number of different protests.
Awesome. Do your former fellow officers stand in solidarity with your beliefs, or have they made you a pariah?
Most of them have made me a pariah because in my activities in Philadelphia, I tried to talk to a few of the blue shirts, the younger officers, and as soon as I started conversation, they turned their head. But I have ran into a few commanders who I worked with and knew me personally, and they talk with me, and they not necessarily support me, but they're very willing to let me know that they're on my side in regards to the movement.
And Ray, the police claim they went after you because you were misrepresenting the force, of course, but you say it was about corporate corruption. What really went on there?
Well, as soon as I got arrested at Wall Street, a couple days later, I got a letter from my own union, the Fraternal Order of Police. And when I was opening it, I thought that they were going to tell me, Ray, we're aware of what happened, and we want to let you know we're going to support you in any way you need. It wasn't the case. Here the letter said that they got a complaint, a grievance from the pension director, and that there was going to be a hearing. So they tried to intimidate me by bringing up my pension, but it didn't work. I'm still protesting in full uniform.
And because of these threats, I mean, do you have any regrets? I mean, you did go through a really hard time facing these threats and also facing almost removing you from the union.
Abby, I have not one regret, nor did I ever come even close to regretting anything I've done in this movement.
Amazing, amazing. I know that you served as a source of inspiration for a lot of people. It was really moving to see you in full uniform out there, along with all the protesters, Ray. Considering how police pensions and other benefits are so closely tied to what happens on Wall Street, why do you think the majority of police were and still are so antagonistic toward the movement? Do they not realize that they're part of the 99%?
A couple of reasons that they're antagonistic. One is that they cannot relate to the occupiers. The occupiers look different, they dress different, they lived different in Zuccotti Park, and what you can't relate to, you fear. And what you fear, you're more likely to attack. And that's why a lot of this action was attributed to the police officers. The other thing is, every officer, and this is a big reason, by the way, every officer, before they join the force, they have to take a test. It's called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory Test. It does not measure intelligence. It measures different aspects of your personality. The two that come into importance here are, number one, they measure your aggressiveness. They are looking for aggressive police because you need aggression in this field of work. The other thing they're looking for is a level of insensitivity, because if they hire somebody who's sensitive, they feel that that person is not going to be able to handle the blood and guts, and they'll quit. And then they will have lost the 6 months worth of training that they gave that officer. What they don't realize in hiring the insensitive person is that person's more likely to beat up someone, and then you got a $25 million lawsuit. So it's not cost effective to hire insensitive people.
Wow, that is fascinating. That's something that I need to explore more. I had no idea that there was this kind of personality test vetting police officers. Do you think that those two factors are why we saw such aggression and a lot of brutality among the movement?
Those two factors, and the fact that, like I said earlier, the police cannot relate to these occupiers whatsoever.
Right. Also, as it came out later, law enforcement organizations were engaging in extensive spying and infiltration of these groups. Why do you think so many federal resources were spent trying to stop Occupy Wall Street?
It was actually a compliment to Occupy Wall Street. That's how much they feared the possible success of this movement.
Why do you think they feared it so much?
Because we wanted to take down Wall Street. We wanted to take down the corporations. And the corporations are what control this country. They are what control every politician by contributing so much money to them that they will win election. In effect, the politicians are merely puppets, and it is the corporations that control this company. Yeah, I'm sorry, this country.
Yeah, no, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference because it's run like a corporation, Ray. You know, as a participant of Occupy Wall Street, looking back kind of over the evolution of the movement and how it's splintered off into a lot of different organizations that are more directly linked to specific actions, what do you think the biggest success was?
The biggest success was the 99% versus the 1% slogan. Whoever thought of that was a genius, because that made a lot of sense to a lot of people across this country. They realized when they read that a certain CEO was making $37,000 a minute, and they were making $37,000 a year, it woke them up. And so bringing that to light made a lot of people realize, wow, there's not just rich people in this country, there's filthy rich people in this country. And I deserve some of that money. When somebody is a multi-billionaire and they are paying their employees minimum wage and will not give them benefits, something's wrong.
I agree. I think the conversation, the shifting of the dialogue was really the biggest success that came out of that. Those statistics that you just outlined are really shocking. But Ray, you know, inequality is higher than ever before. 2 years after Occupy took place. I mean, what do you think needs to happen? Do we need to get in the streets again? How can we really make Wall Street accountable?
We can't. They're too powerful. And they have their police on their side. The first sign I held up the day I was arrested stated, NYPD, do not be Wall Street mercenaries. And unfortunately, they are. So we are not going to bring down Wall Street like we thought in an Occupy way. What is going to have to happen is we're going to have a major economic meltdown.
I fear that you're right. It has to get a lot worse before it gets better. Ray Lewis, former Philadelphia police captain, thank you so much for everything you do, standing up on the side of the people.
Thank you, Abby.
RT has been there since day one of the Occupy movement. And after my break, my fellow correspondents will join me to look back on the past 2 years of demonstrations. Stick around. Occupy Wall Street was a movement born in New York, but in a short time, protesters were occupying public spaces all across the country and even the world. From the mass arrest to the eviction of the camps, RT was there when the corporate media was not. So join me now to give some insight on the movement on the 2-year anniversary. I'm joined by RT correspondents Ramon Galindo in LA, Anastasia Churkina in New York, and Breaking the Set producer Manuel Rapolo right here in DC. Thank you everyone for joining me. I'm going to jump right in here to Nastia. I wanted to start with you being in New York on the anniversary. Talk about the demonstrations happening today.
Well, Abby, today was largely, a birthday party. It was a celebration of what started 2 years ago. We saw people gathering early on in the morning at Zuccotti Park, where it all started 2 years ago, and then events continued all throughout the day. Actually, just now, minutes ago, outside our office, at least 1,000 people marched. The group of occupiers still chanting on the streets today, calling for stopping and frisking Wall Street, calling for taxing the 1%. Curiously, all of the issues that were debated today are the exact same topics that were around 2 years ago. Still, wealth inequality is a huge problem. Occupy Wall Street wants student debt eradicated. They want an end to the crazy military-industrial complex. All of these social, economic, political issues that were around 2 years ago that prompted people to initially come out onto the streets, they still remain today. And that's why people in such big numbers, really more than we expected, came out in New York today.
And Ramon, you were covering Occupy extensively in LA. What would you say, looking back, kind of offering some reflection on the biggest success of this movement?
Well, it clearly emboldened regular people who were not political to come out and fight back against corporate and state power. I think you pointed out earlier in the show how animosity towards Wall Street has never been higher, and these occupiers were really expressing what the American public was already feeling. In the aftermath, though, after the encampments were torn down, one of the most successful things that we've seen is Occupy Fights Foreclosures, where families who also were not political but were victimized by these too big to fail banks are fighting back. They're staying in their homes with the help and the aid of occupiers. And an unfortunate and inadvertent result of Occupy also was the exposure of police militarization in the U.S. Many of these, many in middle-class white America weren't really privy to all the police brutality happening in the U.S. And in fact, many community organizers here in L.A. who worked in poor minority neighborhoods warned the occupiers to not get too cozy with the police. And in the end, the occupiers learned the hard way what police brutality was and how the state can really crack down violently on political dissent.
Very well put. Yeah, I remember in Oakland, kind of the police state cracking down in my backyard, and there was one particular march during the day where there was tear gas canisters and smoke grenades being launched at mothers pushing babies in carriages. It was really shocking, very, very shocking. Manny, on the flip side, though, there have been plenty of criticisms, of course, on Occupy from the establishment, the corporate media, and a lot of other people. What do you think the biggest pitfall of this movement was?
I think it's it would be unfair to say that the movement failed. I think it's erroneous when we hear people say, "Oh, Occupy failed. They weren't able to mobilize enough and organize and get a leadership going." But to some extent, that criticism is fair. I think that when you live in a representative democracy and you hear a lot of the gripes that the protesters had and the demonstrators had about changing the establishment, they weren't trying to change the system of government in the United States. We have a system of government in place that allows for change, that allows for people to go into Congress and enact change. The danger with that is that when you compare Occupy Wall Street to something like the Tea Party, for example, that was so easily co-opted by the Republican Party, it's hard to say, is it a failure on Occupy Wall Street's part? But what I really would have liked to have seen was some sort of political action from them in Congress to get some people elected, to kind of have leaders state by state, community by community, kind of voting people into Congress and enacting change that way. We saw it with Elizabeth Warren to some extent for Massachusetts, but we really didn't see it on a large scale. We certainly didn't see it on the federal level, and we hardly saw it on a state-by-state and local level. So I think that that's probably where you would accurately say that they failed.
Right. I think that it was kind of the benefit and the failure was the lack of leadership, and I really would have loved to have seen a lot more leadership and organization in terms of putting people up in prominent positions that could have maybe gained some political traction there. Nastia, even though encampments aren't up anymore, there have been multiple spin-off groups from Occupy, Rolling Jubilee and other things. What do you think about the evolution of the movement now into more issue-specific direct action groups?
Well, Abby, I think what's curious here is when people talk about, whether or not Occupy is still alive, have they completely fallen apart? The curious thing are these smaller groups. And to some extent, the officials that did thought they were eradicating Occupy Wall Street by evicting them from these bigger permanent camps, what they ended up doing is because they threw people out of Zuccotti Park and other camps throughout the country, they prompted people to find this different way of organizing. And this is something that's been a big game changer, at least according to the results that were achieved. Because if initially we had thousands, if not tens of thousands of people throughout certainly the United States with hundreds of different messages and concerns, what we have now are more narrowly focused groups such as Strike Debt, that is focused on eradicating medical and student debt throughout the U.S., such as Occupy Sandy. It's going to be a year soon since Hurricane Sandy hit, and activists are telling us that still thousands of people are misplaced and still in major need of help. So it's groups like these that are able to provide more attentive and focused attention to specific issues that society is faced with, and to that extent, in some ways, they've been more efficient being smaller but more multiplied groups than just one big, huge group of people on the streets of the United States.
Great point. Yeah, I mean, these smaller, more focused groups are potentially even more active and more successful than even the broader umbrella groups. Ramon, based on what Manny was saying earlier, why do you think that we haven't seen Occupy take that presence in state and federal government like the Tea Party did? I mean, is it just kind of that the Tea Party was totally co-opted? And I mean, why do you think there was such a lack of political support for Occupy's ideals?
Sure. Well, when Occupy first started, it was openly and blatantly mocked by the mainstream media, many in the media calling the occupiers socialists. And as we know, socialism is still a dirty word here in the U.S., and no politician wants to be associated with that. Obviously, when it comes to the Tea Party, they were very well funded by conservative groups and obviously backed by Fox News. And in reality, in covering the Occupy movement, a lot of the occupiers really didn't want to be part of this system which they considered to be corrupt. They wanted to flip it on its axis. And that being said, they are still making an impact politically. Locally, the city of Richmond, California is taking on a controversial plan to save homeowners that are underwater on their mortgage. On the state level, earlier, William Daley, who used to work for Obama, said he's not going to run for governor. They were attacking him because calling him a banker who oversaw the collapse of the economy. And at the federal level, we've seen Larry Summers, who, if it weren't for Occupy, many people may not have known the role that he played in the deregulation of Wall Street. So while Occupy didn't make its way into government, it definitely seems to at least be playing a little bit of an influential role in it.
And Manny, we have about 30 seconds left, but what is it going to take? Is it going to take something really bad to happen, a total collapse for things to get better and for us to really push for change?
You know, I can't help but think of what Captain Ray Lewis said, that it's going to take an economic meltdown or something really bad for that to happen. I'm a little bit more optimistic. I see Occupy Wall Street as a first step toward that, as a step that says we don't have to have a gigantic catastrophe for us to enact change. People are able to get together and come together as a community and enact change. And to kind of build off what Nastia said, you know, these are smaller spin-off groups of Occupy Wall Street that are enacting change. So I think that, you know, there doesn't need to be a big catastrophe. We have it within ourselves to make that change.
Work inside and outside of the system, direct action, get involved. You guys, thank you so much, all the R2 correspondents from around the nation.
Yeah, I take no prisoners, you call it aggressive, but all I see is lies coming out in your message. What can you say?
2 years ago, something profound happened in this country. Thousands staged a sit-in in New York City in one mass demonstration against corporate greed. And in an unprecedented move for my generation, they didn't leave. Instead, thousands camped out, reclaiming the streets for themselves in the heart of America's financial district. Soon, thousands more joined, in turn sparking up Occupy camps in almost every major city in every state. At first, the corporate media totally discounted the protests. But when the crowds grew too large to ignore, the establishment moved to ridicule it instead.
The Occupy Wall Street protest entered its third week today. What started as less than a dozen college students camping out in a park near the New York Stock Exchange is now hundreds of protesters, and it's spread to other cities. But what are they protesting? Nobody seems to know.
Talking Points believes that reflects the media coverage of the occupiers, most of it favorable to them despite the violence and anti-Semitism. It's really incredible when you think about it.
Having sex in public, doing drugs, defecating on cars, and those around other cities that were actually being violent, breaking store windows, cursing out police and all that. You mean those guys? Those guys?
No,
because I have tapes of all of that.
You know, they said there was no unified message, but you can't just have one message against an entire system that's responsible for so many problems. I was there on the first day of Occupy Oakland, and I heard from people from all walks of life about why they chose to be there.
Let's start with why Wall Street bankers are not in jail.
I'm a teacher, and I've taught for 38 years, and Wall Street is taking over education, trying to privatize it, and I'm really for public education.
Because I'm not a multi-millionaire, a lot of times my voice isn't heard.
I'm here because I believe it's time for ordinary people to rise up against the corporatocracy.
Maybe it's not going to happen in this lifetime, but years from now, I was here and I started and helped start the movement.
Maybe it's just me, but I think the unifying message is that the system is obviously broken. This realization by so many is what scared the establishment the most, which is why soon after this organic resistance came a wave of militarized crackdowns by police on almost every camp. For the next month, there were countless incidents of brutality, aggression, and violence by police donned in paramilitary gear. In New York, 400 people were arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge. In Seattle, an 80-year-old woman pepper sprayed in the face. In Berkeley, kids were beat with batons. In Santa Cruz, mace rained down on students. And in my hometown of Oakland, California, thousands of police marched the streets, beating, brutalizing, and launching tear gas canisters and smoke grenades at peaceful protesters. What you're seeing now is footage I shot of a normal night in Oakland at the height of the crackdown. All of this under direct orders from the federal government, which made sure every camp was boarded up for good. Look, 2 years ago was the birth of a grassroots movement organized against the system as a whole. That's why Occupy Wall Street posed such a threat to the establishment. Occupy didn't die. It signified a monumental shift in consciousness. And that's not something that simply goes away.